this panel that we put together is going to look at what makes Turkey probably today a strong country, feeling so strong about itself that it is venturing in international affairs the way it is doing. And I think one of the elements of its strength is the consolidation of constitutionalism at home. And constitutionalism refers to that constitutional order that establishes a way to command, to govern society that is closer to the liberal thinking about limits imposed on government and also the protection of fundamental rights of individuals and groups and so on.
For many actors in Turkey, when they discuss the issue of writing a new constitution, often the example of the US Constitution used is a positive model, is a positive example. And that's something that Turkey can learn from. We have to be, however, quite careful in doing that because there are certainly important things to learn from the US Constitution. However, it is also true that I think in these debates in Turkey, what the US Constitution really is not necessarily understood correctly. I think it is a US Constitution from the Turkish perspective. Perhaps what the Turkish people want to see in a good constitution is often attributed to the US Constitution. So it is important to understand, I think, the US Constitution correctly in these debates as well. Before I say a few things about the history of Turkish political system, how we came to this stage, perhaps I want to make a point which may help to perhaps understand what I want to say later, and that might not be really clear for an American audience. If we ask the question, what purpose do constitutions really serve? What are constitutions? There are certain answers that we find in textbooks. What do constitutions do? They are a basic frame of politics. They lay down the basic rights, the basic institutions, the basic rights of the people in society, and the basic institutions of the political system. In other words, they are a kind of a compromise. In the Turkish context, I think, and perhaps in many developing countries as well, the Turkish constitutions have been written not only for this purpose, or more than this purpose, they have been written as an instrument of development. Because when the Turkish nation state was founded, that was the main goal, the main vision, the main idea in the minds of the makers of the Turkish constitution. The elites that in fact founded the state and that also wrote the constitution, for them, many basic principles of constitution, such as secularism, democratic institutions, the basic rights, were not just valued in themselves, but they were also valued because they were thought to facilitate development. Because the main goal of the project was to create a nation state, a Turkish nation state, which would be on par with the most advanced Western nation states at that time. That was the vision, that was the goal, and constitutions have among many other things that were done at that time, were thought to serve these purposes. So this is an important point because it is, I think, a difference between the US Constitution and a constitution like the Turkish Constitution. So how did what are some issues that in current debates political actors hope to resolve by writing a new constitution? There are two issues that are often quoted. And there is one issue which is not emphasized as much as it should. One issue that people hope to solve with the new constitution is the question of ethnic pluralism in Turkey. And more specifically, a Kurdish question. Turkey has had a Kurdish question almost from the beginning of the foundation of the republic. In fact, this question goes back also to the later periods of the Ottoman Empire. And this question has become a problem, and it has been the cause of a bloody ethnic rebellion since the 1980s in Turkey. It's a major security issue. It's a major social issue. So with the new constitution, it is hoped that this problem will be resolved, along with the other issues of ethnic pluralism.
To a great degree, the American Constitution followed the British model. In fact, the U.S. government structure today is closer to that of the 18th century British government than that of the contemporary British government is. For a constitution to work, it really has to be at least somewhat internalized in the people. And I think America had a leg up on this in that Britain was already a sort of semi-republican and sort of semi-liberal state. And the colonies, even more so, were sort of semi-republican and semi-liberal. So there was already kind of a leg up in creating a modern state when the U.S. was created. The 18th century British government consisted of a House of Commons, a House of Lords, and the King. This structure institutionalized the actual power elements which had existed in medieval society, requiring a kind of consensus among the major components of the class-based system in order to get anything done. Most of the American colonies had a structure somewhat like this, with a royal governor and a legislature. And the states retained structures like this, most of them after independence. Even though American society lacked the aristocracy and monarchy of Britain, the new Constitution remained remarkably close to the unwritten British Constitution. I think when we heard the introduction to the talks today about Turkey and the dynamism that we see in the Republic today as the most prominent example of a Muslim majority nation that is a democracy within a secular state that is a capitalistic market, it's mind-blowing in different ways to think about the categories and to think about the fact, just like as we were going through my CV, it sounds impossible to have all these different identities. It seems difficult to think about the largest and fastest growing economy in the Middle East, the sixth largest economy in Europe, but also an Afro-Eurasian, Caucasus, Balkan country, all that represents one country. And I think it's almost too much to bear sometimes to say all that. And yet, here we stand in a country in which we can say the same thing. This country is both a transatlantic and a trans-Pacific actor. It is both a continental power, but it also has balancing capabilities. So what I want to do is to kind of talk about the story of Turkey, where we are today in terms of the story of Constitution. I want to make a plea in a lot of different ways for why I think that we need to pay more attention to what's going on the Constitution. And despite all the interesting things that are happening today in Turkey, and the Prime Minister's visit throughout the region, the problems that Turkey and Israel are having, the issues that we have between the U.S. and Turkey, that sometimes, by focusing on the short term, we lose track of the long-term goal of having a truly liberal society in which I think liberal does not have to be a dirty word, whatever your political affiliation is. So the story of the Constitution of Turkey, as Murat or Professor Somer has already told us, is something that predates the Republic. The beginning of the Turkish Republic is 1923. But those of you that know your history know that the Ottoman Empire ruled the region of the world we're talking about for 600 years. And actually, the story of Turkey's constitution goes before the Republic. There have been 5 constitutions in Turkey. And let me see if I get them right. The first one was 1876, which was predating the Republic, which was the first Ottoman constitution. The second one was 1921, which was the first Turkish Republic constitution, quickly followed by the 1924 constitution, which then went to the 1961, which went to 1982. If you're confused, you're in a good category, because I think many people in Turkey are equally And I think that what we just heard in terms of the American Constitution is a very different story. It's a story in which there was a constitution put in place, but the way in which we began to practice it and the way in which we began to think about it in terms of words written on a piece of paper began to have a life of their own. And I think one of the interesting things to talk about is the unspoken political cultures and the differences here. When you think about Turkey in terms of it being a democracy, and as we've already heard, it was one of the first to have a multi-party system. What was not said was the fact that in Turkey, the majority of Turkish history has not been written by Democrats. The majority of Turkish history has been written by generals. And what I mean by that, and it's not a negative sense, the founder of the modern republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, was the great hero of the War of Independence. He was also one of the only heroes of World War I. Those of you who remember your history, World War I, the Ottoman Empire got dragged into this war on the side of Germany. It was a disaster by all accounts. The empire was already crumbling. It was getting beat on pretty much every front. The only place that it did not have a disastrous campaign was on a very small piece of land that bordered Europe and Asia called Gallipoli. And there, a young colonel by the name of Mustafa Kemal earned his reputation as the sole victor, at least in the narrative that we hear today in the Turkish Republic. And so when he came and won the War of Independence, or the great tragedy, if you're looking at the Greek side, between the Greeks and the Turks, it was a really interesting mix where Ataturk, by his force of personality, created the modern Turkish Republic in many ways on his own. It's a different story than the U.S. one. We heard about George Washington retiring and going away. We never think about a founding father in the United States. We think about founding fathers, right? You can't have George Washington without Thomas Jefferson, and you can't have them without Abraham Lincoln. You can't have him without fill in the blank. In Turkey, in many ways, Ataturk represents a figure that is so powerful and so politically charged that you cannot touch his legacy. And in fact, there's an entire group within Turkey that have made their entire ideology to become followers of Ataturk, Kemalists. That's the term that's used to describe it. And in many ways, the way in which they have thought of the Turkish constitutional system is their private playground. And in other words, what was written on the paper is nice, but the way it's interpreted matters far more. So even though the Turkish constitution from the very beginning was very liberal in a lot of senses, and what's interesting about the story that I'm telling here is, for every 2 steps forward, there's always 1 step backwards. So it takes you a little bit longer to get where you want to go because you're constantly battling. And I'm not going to put any type of prejudice in terms of why I think that is. We can have an active discussion about that. But I think what's interesting to think about is, while there were rules and there were things written in the Constitution, and there was the rules of the game that were established, it was always kind of an undemocratic system that was in place. Now you can make the argument the reason this happened is very simple. Look where Turkey is located. Geostrategically, it was stuck right in the middle of the center of the world in many different ways. As the Cold War was beginning, you had the free world in the West against the Soviets. Who was stuck in between? Who was on the front lines? That was Turkey. So in many ways, the most important critical actors in the Turkish system had to be generals by necessity. So while the United States was able to go back after these great wars and was able to come back to the homeland, and we had such nice neighbors such as Canada and Mexico, we used to thought it was a nice neighbor at least, we didn't have to deal with any other major powers. Turkey was dealing with a bunch of empires that was trying to split it apart, and during the Cold War had to deal with the Soviet Union trying to take its ports in different ways. So I'm not putting a prejudice here in terms of saying that it's the generals who wrote this history. That was by necessity in different ways. Now, the current Constitution that was written in 1982 was not written by civilians. It was written by the military. In fact, all the constitutions were written in some way by the military, perhaps with the exception of 1876. This was written by the young Ottomans at the time as the Ottoman Empire was beginning to go through its transformation period. And what's interesting about this, and I think that Professor Sommer touched upon this, is that the psyche of the Turkish nation that was created from the ashes left it with a lot of different syndromes. Many people refer to the Treaty of Sevres. The Treaty of Sevres was the treaty that would have destroyed Turkey. And today, what we think of as a modern republic would have been a series of different pieces. It would have been a British area, it would have been a Greek area, it would have been an Italian area, it would have been a French area, it would have been what would have been called Kurdistan, it would have been Armenia, which would have been different than the current Armenian Republic. And so, if you have that type of psychology when you come out of a major war, and you know that the entire world at one point in time was going to split you apart, it can give you a complex of some sort. So I don't necessarily blame my Turkish friends for constantly worrying about what's next and why we think that the Constitution is so important, and how the Constitution and the legality and the words that are there are simply tools of Western imperialism to split our country apart. What actually matters is having a great leader. Thinking about Turkish political history, and when I use the term Turkish here, I'm using the ethnic term, but I'm also going beyond the republic here. Think about all the great Turkish leaders in many ways. And In many ways, I'd start with Genghis Khan. He was on his way west, he had this great empire, and every subsequent group of kind of Ghazi or major warrior figures were military figures. And so in many ways, Ataturk fit right into this. And so he was a great leader that created the Turkish Republic. And in many ways, when the Constitution was created during his times and he enshrined it, the ideas that were put in there in terms of being a secular, democratic republic, that the sovereignty of the people was the most important area. The people gave their loyalty to one leader. And that's something that continues to this day, actually. Even though the Turkish Constitution is there, in many ways, what the current Prime Minister has been able to do, and I would argue this is not just the current Prime Minister, it's happened in the past as well. I would point to people like Adnan Menderes, who was hung by a coup, Turgut Özal, who died prematurely of a heart attack, and the current Prime Minister, Tayyip Erdogan. They've tapped into this kind of, this feeling within Turkey that it's always better to have a great man leader. Because in many ways, by giving him the loyalty, the party system, unlike the United States, which has a two-party system where in many ways it doesn't really matter who the Republican nominee is, we can kind of tell what the general parameters and that they will do pretty well. They will get above a 40% threshold, let's say. In the Turkish case, it matters tremendously. There's currently 21 parties that have actually won votes of some sort, and 40-something, I lose track of how many actually officially registered parties there are in Turkey. And so in many ways, it's all being driven by personality. The current party's only been in existence for the last 9 to 10 years. It's been in power for the same amount of time. So the fact that this party could easily be closed tomorrow by the Constitutional Court or by a military coup of some sort creates a system in which it's more about personalities, and it's about how that person interprets. And the Constitution is less important. So today when you have a discussion about the Constitution, it's a very recent and a new phenomenon. And what's interesting to think about timing of things is, the Turkish Republic is coming up on its 90th year of its life. It was founded in 1923. 2013 will be the 90 years. Unfortunately, when my Turkish friends say we want to be like the United States and we want to have a constitution like that, I think about what the U.S. was going through in its 90-year period. Now, I happen to be from the South. This year we're commemorating the 150 years of war of northern aggression, or the Civil War for those of you up here. And that's something that in our 90th year of birth, we were struggling deeply with. And I would argue in many ways that was the identity struggle for the United States. Was it going to be more about states' rights? How is the federal government going to keep the United States and these states together?
And my question is to you, is what's really preventing Turkey from entering the European Union? Is it Cyprus? Is it...
Currently, when you think about Turkey's accession to the European Union, it's been incredibly frustrated because at every step of the way there's been something stopping it. You know, with the crisis right now, in terms of the financial crisis, in my mind, this is an opportunity for our European friends to think a little bit more strategically. If you want to have a global Europe that can compete with the United States and compete with China, Turkey has to be a part of it.
The Turkish constitution was prepared by generals, and I think it not only smells, it reeks of it. And I think that the Turkish constitution that was made in 1982, which replaced a much more liberal constitution before that, 1961 constitution, it doesn't fit the current republic today. And I think that given that the civil-military relations have changed so dramatically in Turkey, and that Turkey has changed so dramatically, and it's no longer in the Cold War, the 1980s is no longer 2010. We're in a new century. I think it's time for Turkey to begin the very difficult process. It's not easy. I know there's a lot of people who think, well, maybe we can just amend the Constitution a few times. When you have something that is so fundamentally different, you can keep the main principles of the Turkish Constitution. The Constitution has great principles there, but the actual mechanisms, they have to change.